Good evening and welcome to the special called meeting of the Hoover City Council for Thursday, September 12th. I will call the meeting to order and ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Council President Lyda.
Here.
Council Pro-Tem Posey. Here. Councilmember Swiney.
Here.
Councilmember Driver. Here. Councilmember Murphy.
Present.
Councilmember Middlebrooks.
Here.
Councilmember McClinton.
Here.
All souls present, so we will proceed with our agenda. Mayor Brocato, you have the floor to present your 2025 budget.
Good evening and welcome to everyone, and thank you, Council. I'd like to start out by just saying thank you for the opportunity to present this 2024-25 budget. It's a budget that has been built on a careful consideration of our city's needs and a commitment to ensuring Hoover continues to thrive. The economic landscape of our city, this budget reflects a very conservative approach to considering shifts in consumer behavior and the broader economic climate. Although we can't predict the economy ahead of us, I know we are all concerned about the outcome of the presidential election and how that will influence our numbers. We've seen changes in shopping patterns with more residents opting for online purchases, which impacts our traditional brick and mortar. While online sales are growing, the way taxes are distributed from those sales does not benefit cities like Hoover as directly as in-person purchases. Additionally, we are mindful of the effects of inflation on household spending, which has influenced consumer behavior. Despite these factors, I'm proud to say we're presenting a balanced budget that meets the needs of our city and upholds fiscal responsibility. Staffing remains a key focus for us, and one of the more challenging aspects of this year's budget has been managing the numerous hiring requests. As leaders, we must prioritize the areas where additional staffing will have the most impact. Last year, we placed our emphasis on park and rec staffing, ensuring that our growing community had the resources needed for its recreational programs. This year, our focus shifts to the finance department, and it's critical that we strengthen our financial operations and ensuring the department is fully staffed to manage the city's financial needs. We are also proposing upgrades for several positions. The City of Hoover has many capital needs, but we've carefully prioritized projects that will have the most significant impact. Sidewalks to improve pedestrian safety and walkability within the city. A new roof for our library and Hoover Rec Center, ensuring it remains a safe and functional space for all. Vehicle replacement for various city departments will improve efficiency and reduce long-term maintenance costs. And numerous maintenance projects throughout the city. And these projects are essential to supporting Hoover's continued growth and maintaining the high quality of life our residents expect. Employee compensation. Compensating our employees fairly is always a priority, but we must be careful to manage these costs as well. We currently employ 704 wonderful outstanding employees, and 83% of them will receive a 5% step raise this year. That's automatic. It happens every year. We have nothing to do with that. This has a $4 million impact on our budget immediately, each and every year. Each additional 1% cost of living adjustment, or COLA, increases the payroll by about $900,000 per year. This year, I'm recommending a 1.5% COLA in addition to the step increase, which will raise our payroll costs by over $5 million. Last year, we implemented a 2.5% COLA, which combined with the step raise increased our salaries by $7 million. So this brings the total increase in salaries to $12 million over the last two budgets, just to put that in perspective. As city leaders, it's vitally important that we manage our employees cost effectively to ensure that we can continue to provide competitive compensation without compromising the city's financial stability. Sustaining this rate of increase will be challenging and is something that we need to address moving forward. Our fiscal health, I'm just pleased to report that Hoover's finances remain exceptionally strong. We have a stable, healthy reserve, which positions us well for the future. Any deficits in our special revenue accounts have all been rectified. Additionally, all previous capital projects are fully funded, further securing the city's infrastructure and our operational needs. So in conclusion, this budget represents a careful balance between addressing current economic challenges, staffing needs, and ensuring fiscal responsibility. I'm confident that this approach will allow Hoover to continue a path of growth and stability. So at this time, I'd like to invite Ms. Cornett up to provide a detailed overview of the proposed budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor, Council. Wendy, would you advance to the next slide? Just to give a little bit of an introduction and kind of recap of what our approach has been. First, I want to recognize the budget team. Both Claire Hamilton and Mindy Wyatt have spent untold hours trying to put this budget packet together and sitting in hearings. Really a very heavy burden has been placed on both of those individuals, and they have done a great job. And of course, Ken and I have both participated in that process as well. But a significant amount of time has been spent by council and by department heads to kind of spend the hard time, right, to put pencils to paper and figure out what common sense items are to include in the budget. And so in a couple of cases, I also want to give a shout out to our department heads because they actually had to sharpen their pencils twice, and they were kind enough to do that. So a lot of time and effort has gone into putting this budget together, and before I said anything about that, I wanted to make sure we recognize those individuals. As you know, we spent some time having pre-meetings with y'all and pre-meetings with the departments. Our budget team internally talked with each of the departments and heard the needs that they had. And then most recently, we've spent a couple days in public hearings where council got to hear presentations directly from the departments. And that brings us to tonight, which is our first read of the mayor's proposed budget. Our key priorities with this budget, if I were to summarize them into two concepts, it would be conservatism. I'm sure it's not a surprise that an accountant would say we're going to be conservative. I think that's what accountants are known for being. But when I say conservatism, I mean it's a top priority for us to take care of what we have. So to that end, upkeep of facilities and our commitment to employees, those are key important things. As we think about funding capital projects, we want to do it in a way that is sensible. So using a prior year excess amount to fund our capital projects and other requests, just trying to be really wise with those public dollars. So that's what I mean by conservatism. And then by common sense, just being really practical in the kinds of things that we're trying to present here. We want to hold the expenses and required transfers to be no more than the projected revenues. Things like finishing projects that we've already started. Kind of just taking care of business would be what I would call common sense. That, and then of course, taking care of our property, the deferred maintenance and repairs that we might have. So next, Wendy, would you advance to the next slide? So before we really get into talking about next year's budget, I thought it'd be a good idea to provide a snapshot or a projection of where we think we're going to land for the current fiscal year of 9/30/2024. Had to use some projections, conservative projections in doing that. The information you have in front of you is a projection as it relates to revenue. So what we did is we took the 10-month actual revenues that we have, and then using the last 3 years of trends for the last two periods, took the lowest average of what we would expect for the last 2 months to get to this projected total revenue of $172.5 million. On the next slide, we have our projection for expenses. And with our expenditures, we went with our revised budget numbers for each of these categories and then adjusted those amounts for known known expenditures that we knew were going to run over and above. We're going to have one of those in work session that I present to you related to the certificate of need legal expenses, but just a few extra items added into that revised budget to bring our total expenditures for 2024 to $156 million rather. And that gave us an excess of $16.2 million that is projected. As you know, our excess, and on the next slide shows how we use our excess, but our excess is used to fund capital projects. If in fact we do have excess, it is used to cure any deficiency balances that we might have in special revenues. So we have a couple of different special revenue funds that we know historically need funding from the general fund. So about $8.2 million of that $16 million excess is going to be spent curing those deficient balances in the special revenues. And then our expenditure special items, these are our revenue rebates that are paid out, bring us to a net change in the general fund balance of $2.9 million. So that is our projection, and we think it's a conservative one for where we think we're going to land for the fiscal year 2024. We hope it'll be better than that, but this is the best conservative common sense estimate of our increase in general fund that I can give you. Next, I'd like to take a look at this chart. I thought this was a interesting graphic just to plot our expenditures over time as they relate to the trends for our revenues. So what you've seen on the line graph here is the story of how the revenues for the city of Hoover have changed since 2020. And you can see 2021, 22, and even from 22 to 23, some pretty significant spikes in our revenues. One of the things that we know contributed to the spikes in those revenues had to do with ARPA funding and other pandemic-related support that we got that would have helped with that. But that stacked bar chart represents all of the expenditures that the city has. So you can see in 2020 there, that white space between the total expenditures and that revenue line of $130 million, that was more white space than what we have for fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025, right? So that really tells the story of how some of these expenditures are growing over time, while what we're seeing with our revenues is a flattening of the revenues that are coming into the city. So that means that we need to be more careful in planning and trying to control those expenditures to the best that we can. The biggest piece of our expenditures, as you can see, that big orange bar, that represents the total commitment to our employees. Okay, so salaries, benefits, full board cost of employees are shown in that orange bar. So going from $79 million in 2023 to $86 million in 2024 to $92 million, which is what's including what the mayor's proposal is for fiscal year 2025. You can see that's just a steady increase. So it represents kind of a special challenge. We're trying to do our best. The dark green portion of that stack bar is our operating costs. So we're really trying to do a good job of controlling the expense line through the operating section of expenses without reducing the services that the city can provide. Okay, so with that, I think we're ready to introduce the mayor's proposed budget. I want to cover the highlights and then kind of show you a one-pager and then go into a little bit more detail for each of the categories so that you can see the nature of what makes up some of these numbers. So from a personnel standpoint, the mayor is proposing, of course, that we commit to that 5% step raise, which costs the city a little over $4 million. He is proposing a 1.5% COLA. So $1,352,000 is involved in that COLA. Both of those items, as they relate to personnel, we need to recognize these are permanent commitments, right, to the personnel line item. We do have a few limited new positions and upgrades totaling about a little over $600,000, and then a proposed increase in the vehicle stipend of $100 a month, which would bring that stipend from $400 a month to $500 a month. From an operating standpoint, the second challenge to our department heads was to try to reduce those operating expenses that could be controlled by 10%. And everybody went back to the drawing board and the team came together, and I feel like we were effective in trying to hold those operating expenses, hold the line, so to speak, on the operating expenses. There are some expenditures that are tied to consumer price index increases. So we have some contracts that we are obligated to have our prices go up, namely the trash service is one of those that has a CPI index attached to it. And so there are some expenses that cannot be controlled in that sense, but those that can, we try to do our dead level best to do that. We are presenting a balanced or common sense budget, and what that means to me is that we are not going to spend more than what we think we're conservatively going to bring in revenues. And then as it relates to the capital projects, we really took a prioritized need approach that takes into consideration we want to take care of what we have. We want to keep things up. We want to finish projects that we've started. And so what you're going to see is that the mayor's proposal includes use of the majority of the 2024 excess, so $2.5 million of the 24 excess, and the accrued interest in the bond funds, which is $1.5 million, along with some of those special earmarked funds and special revenues like the gas tax and the Alabama Trust Fund to be able to fund key important priority capital projects. So next, we have the summary of the mayor's proposed budget. With our revenues, okay, you probably noticed that $170 million in the general fund of projected revenues. That is a little bit less than what we think we're going to have in the fiscal year for 2024. We've talked about revenues flattening, and so we don't want to project more revenues than what we think is going to happen. The city has lost a couple of key retail places, and so those items were factored in arriving at that number, but we believe the $170.2 million is a common sense expectation for revenues for the city in the general fund. As you know, the special revenues are earmarked funds that come in from a variety of different sources for specific purposes, right? So again, we took an academic approach at estimating what we think those would be. Moving on to the expenditures, right? So we already talked about what commitments related to personnel, how we got to that $92 million. I want to provide a bit of a breakdown for you for each of these different expenditure line items so you can have a little bit more insight into what makes up these numbers. But that personnel line item of 92.2 in the general fund, and then we have another $9 million roughly in special revenues in personnel costs. Those dollars represent the commitments that we just talked about, okay? So the additional positions, the 5% step, the 1.5% COLA, and a handful of upgrades, as well as the increase in the vehicle stipend. The operating costs of $47 million, I'll detail those changes as well. Again, we do have an overall increase in operating, but it's not a big increase from last year in operating, and that is a testimony to the efforts of all the department heads who were willing to go back and sharpen their pencils and try to do more with less funding on the operating line. Our debt service is what it is, $17.5 million, or $5 million of contribution to the city schools. Means that our total expenditures then are $161, leaving us an $8.3 million excess in the general fund. On the next slide, we have tried to anticipate, right, what we think the demands on that excess are going to be. As we evaluated the special revenues, we know that every year there's a handful of special revenues that need to be cured. Their balances need to be cured. So $5.9 million of that transfer out of $8.4 million in the general fund is going into the special revenues to cure that. And then the other portion of the 8.4 is $2.5 million to be proposed and used on capital projects. And that $2.5 million represents a portion of the 2024 projected excess. That's where that number came from. Again, under the special items are projected revenue rebates. The expenditures are our revenue rebates. These are the agreements, the development agreements that the city has engaged in with different developers. And so based on a couple of those agreements rolling off and a couple of them rolling on, that's how we came up. This was an academic approach to get to this $2.1 million in special revenues for a net change of $2.2 million in the general fund. One of the things, again, I want to go back and I want to say, okay, that net change is a negative number, but what I want to remind you about is that we said that there was a 2.5 projected increase in the general fund balance from fiscal year end 2024, okay? So that is the impact of what we're trying to utilize from the prior year excess there. With our projected ending balance for the general fund being $70,529,000. That is just a little bit over where we ended up for the prior year audit. Okay, now on the next slide, let's take a look at some of these, a little bit more detail, breaking down those different expense categories from a personnel standpoint, and really just wanted to show you how we went from $85.8 million in personnel expenditures to a proposed budget of $92 million. Well, this is the roadmap of how we got there. Just with the step and the proposed COLA, we go from $85.8 million to $91.5 million, okay? That's before any new positions and any new upgrades. Just a handful of new positions. There were certainly more requested positions that are on this list, but again, we're trying to be very conservative. I was happy that the finance positions made the cut. City planning, a GIS manager, and then a custodian supervisor were the additional adds. So about $660,000 of additional positions being added. And then we have a handful of upgrades. Really, $63,000 is not a small amount to Jennifer Cornett, but a relatively small dollar impact of these upgrades. But each of these were considered to be priority and important of the requests that were made. And there you can see the $100 per month impact of the increase of the car allowance, which is $14,400. So for new positions and benefit changes, we're looking at an increase of $737,000, and that's the story of how we got to the $92.2 million in total personnel costs. On the next slide, we have some information related to capital, and I guess I kind of skipped over the operating stuff in your packet. There are some detailed pages at the end after the copy of this presentation where you can kind of see the things that were added and the things that were subtracted from those original requests that you got in your budget binders. But just to go ahead and address the capital items that the mayor is proposing, again, we see the three possible funding sources or the three sources that the mayor wants to propose to use are those special revenues, which are those earmarked funds that can be used for paving, et cetera. And the Alabama Trust Fund can be used for capital projects. So we would like to, of course, approved projects totaling $4.3 million coming from those special revenue funds. We'd like to use the $2.5 million in excess, and we are also proposing using the accrued interest of $1.5 million that's sitting in the bond fund and earmarked for capital projects. For the special revenues, again, the breakdown, how did we get to $4,345,000? Well, $3.6 million of that is paving and street resurfacing. And then the Alabama Trust Fund has enough revenue in it to be able to cover the replacement of the rec center roof that is in disrepair and in much need of being fixed. So the special revenue funding takes care of those two projects. We have about $4 million of priority projects that we would like to use the last year's excess and bond interest for. And then we also want to present to council a list of additional priority projects that could be considered for use of the budget stabilization funds if it's so desired. On the next slide, we have a breakdown of where each of these, the detail of each of these projects and what funds they're coming out of. I'm hoping that this kind of detail will help you tie back to the original requests that you heard and saw in your budget binders, right? But this is just restating the special revenue funds are taking care of some paving and roof repair at the rec center. The other $4 million we would like to use for these particular priority projects. The Valleydale Road widening project this is to represent our portion of funding related to this project that was committed more than 25 years ago, I believe. But anybody that's driven down Valleydale Road has seen the efforts of what they're trying to do out there. So wanted to include that as a priority. Also under the heading of some safety concerns, there are some guardrails, traffic signals, and signs. And again, toward the back of your handout packet that you got tonight, there's a better detail of what makes up that $800,000, but each of those items are safety related. The library roof is another project that is in need. You might notice that you might remember that we did replace one of the sections of the library roof this year, but we'd like to complete the rest of the roof and get that one taken care of. A renovation in the finance department to convert some space for workspace for the new employees that we hope will be approved. And then some sidewalks and bleachers make up that $4 million. So again, that's a total of $8,345,000 that the mayor is presenting. We have also vetted some other projects that we think should be considered or would like for council to consider for appropriating a portion of the budget stabilization funds on the next slide. So these are the priority, and I won't go through each one of those. Again, there's greater detail in the back of your handouts tonight that kind of break down the actual projects within each of these departments and categories. But all of these have been evaluated by the budget team as high priority projects that are worthy of attention. And should council decide to go with those projects and release that funding from the budget stabilization fund, that would bring the capital project commitment to almost $12 million. Next, what do we have? Okay, so since we've been talking about budget stabilization, we do have $3,647,252 set aside in this. This is a restricted fund portion of our general fund balance. And just for anybody who doesn't remember, this was a reserve that was created through an allocation of the first 30% of the first 4% increase of our growth in revenue from year to year. And the reasoning behind it was a good one. It was designed to set aside funding that could cover expenses for years where revenue growth was less than 4%. I think we can fairly state that revenue growth from 23 to 24 is not going to be 4%. So this would be an appropriate time based on, in our view, this would be an appropriate time to use those should council decide to do that. So this is the possible source of funding of those additional high priority capital projects we just looked at. The last thing is I wanted to provide a little bit of an update on our bond investment funds, just so that you can see what expenditures have been made from those investments. The remaining committed amounts for each of the projects that were the reasons for that borrowing are shown here. We have spent most of the portion that was allocated to the Hoover Met Complex, still have a little bit more to spend down there. But we have the full amount that was allocated to the Performing Arts Center and a good portion of the amount allocated to the I-459. I got my numbers transposed. I-149, I don't think that's a highway. So pardon that error. But the point of this was really just to show that we've got $80 million left in the investment fund. 77.5 of that is earmarked for the original projects that were intended for it. That leaves a residual amount of $2.6 million. We set aside a little over $1 million for arbitrage because that is money that we will probably not get to keep. And that leaves at present, and this is as of August 31st, $1,549,673 left in accrued interest, and that interest is still accruing, okay? So that is the other source of funding that was being suggested for the capital projects. And I think, is that the last slide, Wendy? I think it is. So that wraps up the presentation of the mayor's proposed budget, but do y'all have questions?
I know the packet is brand new to each of us, as it is to the public, and is their custom. We will take the next, by the calendar, 8 days to examine the proposal, and I've asked for their permission, but the mayor, Mr. Grimes, and Ms. Cornett have all agreed to make themselves available anytime for members over the next 8 days to meet, answer questions, dig deeper as much as you would like, with an anticipation of passing a budget on the 20th at 5:30. Which is next Friday afternoon.
Sounds great.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Mr. Murphy has a question.
Mr. President, just a couple questions just to be submitted at a later date. I want to get them out of here. So can you can just send this to the entire council, the multiplier for employees per dollar overhead. I'd love to kind of know what that multiplier is.
Okay.
Also, could you?
Employee costs per?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Also, it may be in here, the itemization, a spreadsheet itemizing into 10% cut. It's 10%, right?
I believe that is included in the packet with the addition. Did we include that in the capital with the additions and the subtractions for, if you look towards the very back, you should see the additions and subtractions, but I think we also have the ability to pull an itemized list of everything that is approved. If you don't want to work from what was before to now, you'd just like to see what were all the categories that were approved.
Right.
We're going to be putting that together and sending that out to council as well.
Okay, awesome. I don't know if we can do, where's the dollars coming from for SRO for the schools? What?
So those are being funded from the general fund, and they're showing up in the personnel cost line item. It's about $3.6 million.
So I don't know if we can do that this year, but can we modify our spreadsheet to show that probably up under SRO education? I don't know how you'll be able to do it. I mean, it may can't happen right now, but I'll love this, because I see the $5 million for education, so I'd love to kind of see that pulled out as well, too.
We do have the SROs set up as a separate organization, so we could
That'd be
provide a
perfect.
breakdown
Yeah,
for you.
can you add it to the ledger? by chance?
We could?
Okay, that'll be great. And I just got a couple more, Mr. President. Also, this is more of a comment. And again, thank you, Mayor. Definitely has been a great sport of allowing me to not direct at all, but participate in activities with the engineering department dealing with stormwater. Just keep in mind, there's not much grant money out there for stormwater, everyone. I think there's a recent EPA dollars came from the presidential administration, and only state of Alabama only received roughly $400,000, and that was only for distressed small communities. So it's very little opportunity for funding. So I know we've cut a certain 10%, but I would love to see some dollars consideration put back. And I don't know if it's cutting, and you got to look at it and see, put back in the budget for condition assessment and inventory phasing, because that's the only way we're going to know what we have in our system, so we can know how financially we can get there.
That line item is under the prioritized needs for council consideration, I think. Isn't that the sewer study?
Is it in there, or was it pulled?
It was under, on the third page.
Now, I know some funding in there for another portion
Okay.
of stormwater. I'm talking strictly about,
I think this was for the study. Am I right? The-
yeah, that's Green Valley.
is?
I'm more
Okay.
so talking about, I know the engineering department has set up a zoning, which you call a basin, and I think it's 7 zones of the city. And what that will do is you look at each zone. You're not going to be able to do it all at one point. Each zone, the conditions of the assets, the type of assets, to know what you have from a public standpoint. And that's how we can kind of build out our capital budget down the road. Then we could talk about how to possibly fund it down the road, okay? So that's not in here. So just consideration on that piece. That's all I have, Mr. President, right now.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Cornett, thank you very much. If you can, you can't do it on the spot right now, but these next few days, I'd like to see a study of other cities our size in terms of what they're doing for their employees on a COLA. And I'd also like to see a study on the car allowance. I know other cities are much smaller than us, so I don't expect us to be compared to, say, Trussville, but maybe like an Auburn or Tuscaloosa, that kind of thing. And help me understand, I've been self-employed my whole life. I'm a small business guy, so when it comes to steps, a step raise is a merit raise, correct? No?
No.
Okay, so help me understand.
Yes and no.
Yes and no, but it's something you have to do anyway, right? Correct? Yes or no?
It is an annual
Oh, okay.
increase of staying and performing in your job. Am I speaking correctly, Misha?
And I'm assuming okay, so it's gonna happen
It's not,
anyway.
it's not specifically tied to a performance evaluation or anything.
Thank you.
Any other comments tonight, Ms. Cornett? Thank you.
It can be withheld. Misha, do you want to come up and talk? I should have had her come up and answer that question in the first place.
You're enlightening me. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Good evening.
Hey,
So it is tied to performance by way of if the employee is not performing up to standard, minimum standard, then that raise can be withheld,
okay, so,
thus prohibiting the next step.
gotcha,
increase.
thank you. So does that mean that, does this happen a lot? We withhold raises?
It can happen. Typically, if you are managing that process appropriately, managing the behavior, it may remedy itself by way of coaching and appropriate disciplinary action, thus remedying it from the performance.
So help me.
Okay. So with that being said,
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10
how
being a
often does it
lot.
happen? It doesn't happen often.
That's all I want to know. Thank you.
Okay.
But Misha, do you want to talk about the bands? There's the
Less than one.
I think that's important.
Okay.
It's not an unlimited 5% forever and ever.
No, it's not 5% in perpetuity. So our scale is based from 1 to 13, and for public safety scale is from 1 to 10. Thus, when you get to, in public safety, once you get to the 10, there's no more increase. The only way an employee would receive an increase is by way of a COLA for the employees that are topped out.
What percentage of our employees are topped out?
I don't have that number right off the top of my head.
Can you get it for me
I think
later?
it's like 80,
Yeah,
80%.
17%?
17.
70%
Wow,
are
that's a good,
top.
thank you.
Sorry, Misha, for putting you on the spot. Any other questions?
Ms. Cornett, was that 7-0 or 1-7?
17%.
17, thank
Yes,
you.
sorry, I should
couldn't hear
enunciate
well.
better.
Thank you.
83% are not topped out and eligible for the step.
Any other comments for Ms. Cornett tonight? Very well. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, and for all your staff, Mr. Grimes, Ms. Cornett, for your staff who have worked tirelessly, and the department heads who have all worked incredibly hard over the last several weeks, perhaps months, in bringing this together. All right, that brings us to the end of our special call meeting. We will adjourn and stand in recess